peace had lasted too long. Life might have already forgotten that war is the true constant of evolution. This was the snowball Earth period, over 700 million years ago. White glaciers covered every corner of the planet. In this frozen world, there seemed to be no trace of life. But beneath the thick, solid ice, life was brewing a new transformation. Sponge-like organisms similar to Atavia were rapidly spreading under the ice. For tens of millions of years, they greedily filtered cyanobacteria from the seawater, gradually clearing the once murky oceans. Near the equator, sunlight penetrated the thin ice and reached the seafloor. Algae began to flourish, and Earth's oxygen levels skyrocketed. The rising oxygen levels gave rise to more complex multicellular life. Most of them either performed photosynthesis on their own or, like modern fungi, absorbed nutrients directly through their outer cell layers. But some multicellular organisms took a different path. We don't know exactly what they looked like, but we think they might have resembled Trichoplax, a simple organism still alive today. When these creatures encountered food, they would transform part of their body into a temporary digestive cavity, enclosing and breaking down the food inside. Over time, their descendants began to retain this cavity as a permanent feature. This marked a turning point. Their cells split into two types: outer cells and inner cells. The outer layer became better at withstanding harsh conditions, while the inner cells specialized in digesting and absorbing nutrients. And so the first true digestive system was born. It was this obsession with eating that ultimately gave rise to all the animals we see today, the group we call Eumetazoa. Snowball Earth hadn't ended yet, but beneath the ice, these organisms were pushing cell cooperation to new levels. As their bodies grew larger, moving with tiny cilia was no longer enough. So, some of their cells began to specialize. They evolved the ability to stretch and contract. If all of these movement cells contracted in sync, they could change the shape of the whole body, offering far more power and flexibility than single-cell motion. Even today, jellyfish still use this ancient form of locomotion. But to pull this off, the contractions had to be precisely coordinated and fast. To do that, these organisms turned to a rare type of biological signal: electricity. These movement cells controlled charged ions on their membranes, producing tiny electric currents. Those currents traveled quickly between cells, allowing them to contract in perfect unison. Eventually, some cells became specialized just for carrying these electric signals, and the first primitive nervous system began to form. That's when animals truly learned how to move. Around 630 million years ago, Earth's thick sheets of ice finally melted. A new era began. The Ediacaran period had arrived. In the first 10 million years, explosively reproducing microbes covered the shallow seas with a thick layer of microbial mats. Above them, dense algal forests rose like underwater jungles. A dreamlike age of abundance and growth had begun. But for the first 50 million years of the Ediacaran period, some unknown factor seemed to be holding animals back. The Eumetazoa of that time left behind only a few fossil traces, mostly just clusters that looked like embryos. Then, around 580 million years ago, after a brief glacial period lasting several 100,000 years, that mysterious barrier suddenly vanished. Visible animal fossils began to appear in the sediment layers. Most of these creatures lacked hard parts, so nearly all of their fossils are soft-bodied impressions, which are notoriously difficult to preserve. As a result, fossils from this time are extremely rare, but they're found all over the world. It's as if the Earth itself is telling us, this was a golden age for animals. Today, we call this burst of evolution the Avalon explosion. However, the pioneers of these animals became lost in this dreamlike age. With endless microbial mats covering the world, there was no longer any need to evolve better movement to survive. Many animals neglected their muscles and nervous systems, and some even abandoned their digestive systems altogether. The creatures that evolved from this era, what we now call Ediacaran animals, ended up with body forms that defy everything we think of as animal-like. In fact, when people see reconstructions of these creatures, they often ask the same question: Wait, are these even animals? Because these events happened so long ago, our understanding of Ediacaran animals is very limited. Among the most famous are creatures like Dickinsonia. They looked like tacos spread out on a table, lay on instinctively on the seafloor and voraciously feeding on microbes in the microbial mats. There were also feather-like animals, such as Charniodiscus, drifting with the currents in the seawater, filtering food particles suspended in the water. Besides these, there was a group called rangeomorphs, arguably the most astonishing of the Ediacaran animals, because they looked so much like plants. Their body plan was unlike any modern animal, a fractal branching structure. Simply put, each branch of their body was a smaller copy of the whole. This design allowed every single cell to be evenly exposed to nutrients in the seawater. With such a body structure, they focused only on cell division, paying little attention to developmental control. They just kept eating and dividing, constantly producing smaller versions of themselves to grow larger. Any part that broke off from their body could potentially develop into a clone. They abandoned all defenses and most of their ability to move, concentrating solely on feeding and reproduction. This dreamlike era lasted more than 30 million years. Then, around 540 million years ago, during another ice age, almost all Ediacaran animals mysteriously vanished, just as mysteriously as they had appeared. Because the fossil record is extremely scarce, it's difficult to know exactly what happened during those tens of millions of years. But every feast must come to an end. For over 30 million years, Ediacaran animals voraciously devoured the microbial mats. As food became scarcer, animals had to start investing energy into competing for resources. Even the group of taco-like creatures who had only known non-stop feeding gradually began to fuse the front part of their bodies into a head, likely equipped with sensory organs. By the last 10 million years of the Ediacaran period, animals began to look less strange. Some grew tentacles to actively capture prey from the water, while others evolved teeth capable of scraping algae. But the biggest winners were another group of Eumetazoa, those who didn't join the feast from the start. For a long time, they remained tiny creatures only a few millimeters in size. They might have crawled along the seafloor or swum near it. Have you noticed something different? Yes. Unlike other Ediacaran animals, these little creatures moved with their own will. Because movement had direction, their bodies developed distinct front and back ends. As a result, their sensory organs concentrated at the front, giving rise to the concept of a head. Above them drifted predators, below was the safe seafloor and creating a clear difference between top and bottom. Thus, they developed a dorsal backside and a ventral belly side. Left and right sides were the same. Naturally, their bodies became bilaterally symmetrical, and so the bilateria stepped onto the stage of evolution. Today, platyhelminthes and xenoturbella largely still follow the lifestyle of early bilaterally symmetrical animals. Although their body structure was already established, there was still a crucial step for these feeding-focused Eumetazoa. Their digestive cavity could break down food, but the waste had to be expelled back through the mouth. This created a serious problem. They had to wait until digestion was complete and waste expelled before eating again. An obviously inefficient process. So, at least two lineages of bilateria independently evolved a through gut, turning the digestive cavity into a complete digestive tract. Food moved in one direction, entering through a mouth at the front, and waste exiting through an anus at the rear. This allowed them to eat and excrete simultaneously, literally tunneling through the microbial mats as they fed. Species like Elingia spiciformis and Icaria wariutia, living over 550 million years ago, used this method to burrow in the mats. They are the earliest known bilateria. Besides that, many other trace fossils show animals crawling and wriggling around. Although we don't know exactly who left these traces, there's one very important change. Some of these animals began to develop hard structures in their mouths. At first, these hard parts may have been just tools to help them dig more efficiently through the microbial mats. But the difference between a tool and a weapon depends on who it's used against. One sunny afternoon during the Ediacaran, after tens of millions of years of feasting, the Ediacaran animals were shocked to discover a group of creatures suddenly bare their fangs, biting ruthlessly into their own kind, shattering the fragile peace of this broken paradise.